Okay, let's begin. Good evening, everybody. My name is Jakob Eifert. I'm associate professor at the University of Chicago in the History Department and the Department of East Asian Languages and Civilizations, and I'm going to host the event tonight. So welcome. The event is, welcome to another round of the East Asia by the Book CS Author Talk series, an event that is sponsored by the Center for East Asian Studies here at the University of Chicago, and co-sponsored by the Seminary Co-op Bookstore. If after the talk you should feel tempted to purchase Professor Hammond's book, you might consider doing that from the website of the Seminary Co-op. The store itself is still closed, but you see here on the screen a link to the Seminary Co-op, which is, I would say, I was always told, the best academic bookstore in the country, certainly one of the best academic bookstores in the country. We begin today with a presentation by Professor Hammond, and I'll do the introduction in a second, and then that will be followed by Professor Pomerance as discussant. So we will have, I think, about 25 minutes for Kelly, Professor Hammond, then that will be followed by about 15 minutes of discussion by Professor Pomerance, and that should leave us about 20 minutes for Q&A. So Professor Hammond, why don't you take over?
Great, thank you so much for that introduction, and thank you to the University of Chicago Center for East Asian Studies for having me. Also, thanks to Connie for being so organized and getting all of us here on time and making sure everything ran smoothly. Really appreciate that. And of course, thanks to Jacobi for hosting, and to Ken Pomerance for commenting on my book. I think one of I've done a couple book talks so far, and I think one of the most sort of interesting and rewarding aspect of this is getting different people's takes on the book after they've all read it. So I'm looking forward to having a conversation about my book with Ken Pomerance, as well as with the audience. So I'm going to share my screen and play my slideshow. So I do have a presentation today because I have a lot of visuals and images that I think help sort of reinforce some of the points I'm trying to make, especially with the sort of time restrictions that we have. So my talk today is entitled Supporting the Faith, Building the Empire, Imperial Japan's Islamic Policies in World War II. And what I'm going to try to do in this short amount of time is sort of show how by supporting Islam, the Japanese empire was hoping to help build and construct their empire. And really what I'd like to do is draw on a couple of examples from my book and talk a little bit about that. So before I do that, though, because I know that a lot of people here might not have had the chance to read the book yet, I would like to sort of preempt the talk by talking a little bit about the conclusions that I make in my book, as well as sort of talk about what the objectives were in writing this book. So my first objective was to insert Sino-Muslims into the historiography of World War II. Because anyone who's familiar with the historiography of World War II, I think would know that ethnic minorities who are now find themselves living within the People's Republic of China, their voices don't usually get heard. And as someone who specialized in the history of Islam in China, I sort of found that to be an interesting project to sort of address and take on. And then I also wanted to reinstate agency to Sino-Muslims in the early 20th century state building projects in China, and to look at the ways that Sino-Muslim communities before the Chinese nationalists or the Chinese communists got involved with them, had their own ideas of how they wanted to reform and bring themselves, into the sort of modern nation state. And, some of them were comfortable with the sort of ethno-nationalist policies of the Chinese nationalists, while others were looking for other benefactors to sort of support their own ideas for nation building. And I think that these sort of contestations that take place are important to acknowledge. And this brings me to the third point about sort of acknowledging and examining state building effort on the margins among non-Han communities. And I think my work sort of is part of a growing group of academics who are sort of looking to the peripheries for state building efforts and looking at the ways that state building efforts take place on the periphery to sort of refract those back on the construction of Han Chinese identity in the first half, late 19th and first half of the 20th century. So this idea of supporting the faith or supporting Islam in this particular case is sort of really important in my book. And I'm going to briefly talk about three sort of tangible policies that the Japanese Empire was trying to implement with some degrees of success, first among Muslim populations in occupied China, and then later in sort of more later in broader areas in the global East, the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. So the first of these, which I discuss in detail, of the opening and supporting of Islamic schools, which became a sort of contested ground between the Chinese nationalists, the Japanese Empire, and the Muslim populations themselves. As well, the Japanese Empire was sending Japanese-sponsored Hajj delegations to Mecca, hosting events, and then this sort of global coordinated tea policy and these really interesting documents that sort of relate the cultural symbolism of drinking tea to a sort of commodification of certain products and the creation of new Muslim consumers. And then this is sort of related to this idea of building the empire through propaganda, which featured Muslims as quote unquote success stories. I think the Japanese Empire was trying to sort of present itself as a benevolent supporter of Islam, much in the way that Mussolini and Hitler and the Nazis tried to do their Axis allies on the other side of in the Mediterranean and in Europe were trying to do. And I think that a lot of this was done through propaganda, which appealed to anti-Soviet and anti-imperial inclinations that were already held by many Muslims. So the sort of anti-communist, anti-Soviet rhetoric, as well as the anti-imperial rhetoric, wasn't really a hard sell for a lot of Muslims who lived not only in China, but who lived in Indonesia, in the Philippines, and in other places beyond even the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. So I approached this project, which I began many, many moons ago when I started grad school. It was really the very beginning of this project. Sort of iterations of it even started before I began my PhD. And the questions that I brought to the project were, what were the Japanese motivations for supporting Muslims in China? And what did they actually hope to benefit from supporting Muslims? And were they actually successful? I didn't know if they would be at the beginning when I started this. So why and how were they successful? And what do their efforts tell us about the position of Muslims in China in the 1930s? And how did the Chinese nationalists and the Chinese communists respond? Some of the other conclusions that I drew from my research questions were that the Japanese were successful in recruiting Muslim populations in occupied China through specific policies, but only to a certain degree. And there was pushback, there was resistance, there was, compromise that had to be made on the part of the Japanese, depending on where these policies were being implemented. And so I think it really highlighted to me that there was a variety, there were ways that people could respond to the Japanese occupation, and that the Japanese occupation was not just some sort of flat, homogeneous experience for all minorities who were living throughout occupied China, and that depending on where you were living, you might be able to push back a little bit against some sort of reform policies. And another conclusion that I draw is that the Chinese nationalists, especially, and the Chinese communists were well aware of Japanese efforts to curry favors to Muslims and responded to Japanese successes in kind. And I do argue in the book that a lot of the Chinese nationalist ethno-policy that sort of is developing during the war, that actually even gets taken with them to Taiwan when they retreat after the Civil War ends, or after they are defeated in the Chinese Civil War, is really created as a response to what they see as quote unquote successes of the Japanese empire. So some of the ethno-nationalist policies that are being developed while the Chinese nationalists are in Chongqing are, number one, a direct response to them being in closer proximity to ethnic minorities than they'd really ever been before, when they'd been a sort of coastal party. And number two, just sort of watching what the Japanese were doing and responding to that. So some of the conclusions that I go on to draw were that Sino-Muslims who participated in empire building projects became what Robert Cruz identifies as quote unquote imperial cosmopolitans. And I don't think that these people ever imagined themselves as peripheral to the rest of the world. And in fact, many of them participated very actively in the Islamic world via connections in Tokyo. And these networks that they created and maintained through their affiliation with the Japanese empire were quite important to sort of spreading information about anti-colonialism and anti-Soviet resistance. Another conclusion that I draw is that there was no united Muslim voice of resistance against the Japanese during World War II, as is generally stated by the Chinese Communist Party, but rather there was a plethora of competing voices with many different agendas. And to assume that everyone wholeheartedly resisted the Japanese, although many people did, I think really, it just misses a lot that people, there were groups of people who did not actually resist the Japanese. And in the words of Adib Khalid in his great book, Making Uzbekistan, the Japanese were able to, quote, locate different actors and examine how they mobilized, both symbolically, materially, to achieve their goals. So I like to start with this image of these young Tatar women who, these young women actually, and their community were refugees from the refugees from the Russian Revolution, and they had made their way from the Volga Tatars. They'd made their way across Siberia and ended up in Japan with the help of a number of Pan-Asianists and Pan-Islamists at the time, who brought them to Japan, and they lived. They created this community in Tokyo. And the Japanese Empire saw this as a great opportunity for propaganda and sort of regularly brought out this group of people to use them as, number one, anti-Soviet propaganda, but also to show their sort of support for Islam. And so here, this is a photograph from 1936 of the pupils of this Islamic school praying for the success of the German-Japanese alliance against Bolshevism. And so what this meant is that the Japanese Empire, by the time they are working in Manchukuo and coming in more direct contact with larger groups of Muslim populations, they already have a sort of template for how they're going to work with young Muslim children. And so they approach their their sort of education of Muslim children in Manchukuo, similarly to the way that these schools for these young Tatar children are opened. And you can see on the board here, on the side, it says that the student is writing in Arabic, but the script is actually not Arabic. It's something closer to sort of like East Turkestani, which would be based on Chagatai. And then on the other side, the young children are also learning Japanese. So they're being educated in, and probably they would have maybe learned Russian as well. So, you know, they're learning a couple languages at school. And then here is another one of these Tatar Muslim children learning Japanese in Tokyo in 1942. So with this sort of model of this multilingual, multi-confessional, or religious school system, the Japanese Empire quickly brings a number of Muslim schools in China under their control. And here's the opening of one, and then they also establish a bunch of new schools. Here's the establishment of one school. We can see the flag of Manchukuo and the Japanese flag being flown outside of this Muslim elementary school, and the opening ceremonies. And so what I argue in the book is that these schools became a sort of contested battleground. And there was never any effort by the Japanese Empire to stop teaching Arabic completely, but they did need to sort of figure out a way to insert Japanese into the curriculum, because they knew that most of these children needed to speak Chinese in their daily life, and they understood the value of having a group of people who could also converse in Arabic to be able to use as diplomats and intermediaries and middlemen with their dealings in the Middle East. But Japanese was really the sort of bureaucratic language. So finding time in these school schedules to fit in Japanese language training became a sort of place of resistance for some communities. And in certain places, they had more success than others getting more Japanese classes into the curriculum. And these tables here are from a report by a well-known Japanese researcher named Kobayashi Hajime, who spent many years on the Chinese mainland collecting data and doing research on Chinese Muslims. And I think one of the things that I found the most interesting was that many of the people who benefited or were sort of enfranchised by some of these new schools and language programs were young women. And they regularly would win. Young women were regularly contestants in Japanese language competitions, and if you rose amongst the ranks and sort of won at the local, the higher than your sort of like municipal level, many of them were invited to go to Japan on trips. And you can imagine for a 13 or 14 or 15-year-old girl who might not have really had a chance to have an education, the experience of getting the experience to travel to Japan would have been quite exciting at this time. So here are just some images of some of these young women from Mengjiang traveling to get there. They're doing some first aid drills, and then they're traveling around Tokyo on this little tour. And then, of course, some of them would stay on and continue their Japanese studies in Tokyo. Okay. So with regards to schools, I think that the Japanese Empire also saw the value of sort of showing how important schooling was to the Japanese home islands and to their sort of imperial aspirations. And there's quite a bit of actually propaganda produced for the Middle East and distribution in the Middle East about Japanese school systems on the home islands. So I just thought I would include that. And then, so these policies, which started in Manchukuo, after 1931, 1932, really sort of came to fruition, or sort of came into their full capacity after the establishment of the Greater East Asia Co-Prosperity Sphere, where by 1941 and 1942 and 1943, we see students from all over Southeast Asia, from the Dutch East Indies, from the Philippines, students from Afghanistan, so places beyond the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere, coming to Tokyo to study Japanese. And these three young men here are three young Moro, which are a Filipino minority, a Muslim minority, who were not only in Japan to learn Japanese, but after their Japanese classes were done, they stayed on to take police training. And the intent was for them to go back to the Philippines and become police officers in the Philippines. So the sort of, the fact that all of these young Muslims were studying together in Tokyo in this sort of moment is a sort of interesting sort of nexus to think about. So another thing that happened in 1938, the third mosque in Japan is opened. The first two mosques in Japan were built entirely with money provided by South Asian benefactors. So the Kobe Mosque and the Nagoya Mosque are mostly built with the money from people who are coming from South Asia and are living in those places as traders. But the Tokyo Mosque is built and erected by the Japanese government and opened in 1938. And at the opening of this mosque, the Japanese government invited Muslim dignitaries from all over the world to come and participate. And so you can see there's people wearing fezzes. There's a Saudi delegate who's not actually Saudi, some Yemenis, and people from China are all sort of participating in the opening ceremonies of this mosque. This is actually the guest of honor. This is Prince Hussein of Yemen, and he's arriving at Tokyo Station after spending a couple of weeks in Shanghai. And for a while, I was sort of confused about why the Prince of Yemen was the honorary guest at the opening of the Tokyo Mosque. And after a lot of reading and research, I figured out that actually the fascists in Italy had actually created a strategic alliance and a friendship agreement with the Yemenis to help thwart off British imperialism on the Arabian Peninsula. And so a lot of the arms that the Yemenis were using in the 1920s were out of their sort of alliance with fascist Italy. And so obviously the Italians, as a sort of goodwill gesture, had urged Prince Hussein of Yemen to go to the opening of this mosque. And then this is the Saudi delegate, a man named Hafiz Wahab, who I'm actually starting to learn a little bit more about. He's a really interesting character. Here he is arriving at Haneda Airport in 1938. And he was born an Egyptian, but later naturalized as a Saudi. And he was the first Saudi ambassador to the Vatican and one of the first Saudi directors of the Arab American Oil Company. And one of the things that I found interesting was someone had mentioned to me that perhaps he was the first ambassador to the Vatican, and he's sent to Japan on this mission because he's not Saudi. Like, he's naturalized as a Saudi, but they can use him to sort of go to these places where it might not be a good idea to send, someone from the Saudi royal family. So I'm sort of looking in, he's quite a prolific and well-known character, but I've been looking into him a little bit more. And the opening of the Tokyo Mosque was a sort of great propaganda success for the Japanese Empire. It was recognized in all kinds of different newspapers around the world. Here's a Dutch newspaper writing about it, as well as an Arabic newspaper. And one of the things that was important for my story about the opening of this mosque was that there were 5 delegates that were there from the Chinese Muslim Association. And here they are visiting the Meiji Jinju, or the Meiji Shrine in Tokyo in 1938. So here you can see the Chinese delegates kind of on the side here. One of them's wearing a more traditional Chinese dress, and then they're being walked by some women, and then you can see the Japanese military on the side there. And so one of the men that was at the opening of the mosque is a Chinese man named Tang Yichen, whose family is quite well known in Beijing in the 1930s. He's an ardent anti-communist, and he had a journal that he published that came under Japanese auspices after the Japanese occupation. He writes this very long and extensive Hajj journal, essentially is like a sort of apologia, which sort of traverses his journey on the Hajj, but also sort of breaks down some of the stereotypes that we might have about the deep division, perhaps, between nationalist supported Muslims and Japanese supported Muslims. And so this is just a map of the trip, the Hajj that he took. So they secured funding from the Japanese Empire, but the Japanese Empire would not support them in any other way on their Hajj. And so that required some maneuvering on their part. They eventually, the group eventually got passage on an Italian ship. And that meant that they had to end in Eritrea. Their journey ended in Italian occupied Eritrea. From there, they spent a number of weeks in East Africa. And then they, after their medical quarantine was over, they took another boat over to Jeddah and then performed Hajj. So they go on this, this trip. If we look at all of the other places that they stop along the way, all of them are British colonial possessions, Hong Kong, Singapore, Colombo, and Mumbai. So the fact that this trip happened in December 1938, it sort of happens at this fortuitous moment, because I think probably 1 year later, after war had broken out in Europe, it might not have been possible. Oh, and I just included this because it's a neat, they might have taken a book like this with them, the Hajj manual for Chinese people. So the outcome of this Hajj was that the Japanese requested and actually got negotiations through a Japanese diplomat, a high-level Japanese diplomat, to hopefully negotiate for an oil concession in April 1939. And the Saudis sort of presented them with a catch-22 and were not really in favor of that. So that never actually came to fruition, but I think we can all sort of imagine if it had. And then in the final part of my book, I talk a little bit about the sort of global exports and the ways, I use tea as an example of the ways that the Japanese were trying to create new markets of Muslim consumers. And this is mostly because I found all these fabulous documents produced by the Japanese Muslim Association about the, Japanese tea and Muslims around the world. And these were sort of tied in to larger economic programs about, where the Japanese Empire could export the products that they made within their empire to places beyond the empire, and what they could import to other places. But what I thought that was really interesting about this was that it was really a global policy, and it was meant to sort of undermine Western dominance and Western markets, especially in places like India, North Africa, and Central Asia. So there was an active program put in place by the Japanese government to sort of create new markets for consumer goods that were made in Japan, in order to displace other markets. So these are just sort of similar charts and about some of these other products and goods that were produced and things that could be imported and exported. But I think what's important about this is that it's not just limited to the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. We see that the Japanese Empire is interested in sort of creating this large network of places to trade with, and that is something, I think they were thinking about. So that these are more graphs about that kind of similar things where Muslim producing countries or Muslim oil producing countries. So just to sort of look ahead and what I'm sort of hoping to do in the next, with my next project, as Jacobi Firth mentioned, I'm thinking about just sort of taking this project into the early years of the Cold War and maybe making it a little bit more diplomatic history. And this comes out of some really interesting documents I found in Taiwan a couple of years ago when I was doing research there. And this particular telegram is from 1967. It's congratulating Suharto on his assumption to political power after the coup. So I think that, just sort of seeing how the Chinese Muslim Association in Taiwan was vehemently anti-communist is really important to sort of thinking about the way that Muslims participated in the Cold War in East Asia and the sort of politicization of Islam in this space. So these are some other books. And so this all comes together again with the construction of a mosque. I'm finishing up a paper right now that hopefully will be published. It's in a revise and resubmit format right now about the opening and construction of the Taipei Grand Mosque, which was built in 1958 and opened in 1960. So many of the sort of similar tropes occur that, to the mosque in Tokyo in 1938. And the sort of politicization of this space as an anti-communist bulwark for the nationalists in their efforts to gain Muslim allies around the world, in their efforts to retake the mainland from the Chinese communists. And then this is just an image of a Japanese Muslim with some Saudi delegates in Japan in the 1960s. And finally, the father of the current secretary, general secretary of the CCP, Xi Jinping's father, Xi Dongxun, is here meeting with Sino-Muslim leaders in the 1950s. So just sort of exploring and thinking about these connections as they sort of traverse the war into the new political era in post-war East Asia. So I will end there. I would like to thank everyone for their time and attention, and I really look forward to some of the conversation that hopefully we can have here today.
Thank you, Kelly. Thanks for this fascinating talk. Before we continue with the discussion, let me just reiterate that if you have questions, you can already start typing them under Q&A. So at the bottom of your Zoom page, you see Q&A, and that is where you can post your questions. And then after Professor Pomerantz has started his discussion, then we will proceed and with the questions in the sequence as they come in. Okay, Ken, why don't you take over?
Thanks very much, and thank you, Kelly, for this talk, which is really interesting. I wanted to start just by pointing out something that is crystal clear in the book, but maybe was not emphasized much of the talk, and that the audience may want to know, which is that the category Sino-Muslims, as it's used in this book, is not just Muslims living within the borders of what is today China. It's Muslims who speak Chinese and live in a predominantly Chinese environment. So it's not Uyghurs, it's not Kazakhs, it's Sino-Muslims. And I think one of the things that's really interesting, both in the book and in the talk, is the emphasis on how the Japanese wanted to use these Sino-Muslims as bridges to Muslims elsewhere. But I guess one thing I was interested to hear more about is that the Japanese obviously understood that they first needed to subdue and stabilize China, and that they were having a lot of trouble finding competent and credible collaborators. And here I think it's crucial for us to remember that unlike most of the places that Japan invaded from 1937 on, China, however much it might have been oppressed by imperial powers, was not a colony, right? So unlike a place like the Philippines or Java, where the ethnic majority is disenfranchised by the fact of a foreign ruler, and so you can appeal to them as saying, here we are to liberate you, right? That's much more difficult for the Japanese to pull off with respect to the Han Chinese majority. Not that they didn't try, but it's much harder. And so Sino-Muslims in some ways would seem like a logical place to turn for people to help them rule China itself. And we don't hear very much about that either in the book or in the talk. And so I wanted to find out if we could hear a little bit more about it and how those kinds of efforts do or don't link up with the efforts to mobilize Sino-Muslims to penetrate places that are more usually thought of as the Islamic world.
Okay.
Second thing, which in some ways comes off of that first one, is that it's really interesting that the Japanese think of approaching Sino-Muslims as Muslims more than as a category of Chinese. And this, again, I think is something that's really stressed in the book. And my impression when I think about how the Japanese deal with other minority groups within the space that is now the PRC is that they're primarily interested in those minorities that have a territorial base and so a potential basis for separatism.
Mm-hmm.
So Mongols, Manchus, obviously, in the Northeast, Uyghurs to some extent, though they don't really get there very much. And that with other, geographically dispersed minorities, Miao, Hakka, etc., that don't have a sort of single homeland, they make overtures to them as well, and they're certainly emphasize that to them that they are oppressed by the Han majority.
Right.
But they seem to make, in general, less effort, right? It seems less important to them. And I think one of the interesting things you show us is that the Sino-Muslims seem to be an exception to that division that I just described, right? This is a group without a clear homeland and basis for separatism that nonetheless gets a lot of attention. And I was wondering, sort of, is that explained simply by the large number of co-religionists that they have elsewhere in the world that makes them a sort of more attractive target than, say, the Hakka? Or is there something else going on? Is there a sort of civilizational esteem that's also playing into this? I don't know, so I'd be interested to hear what the story is. And that, I guess, brings me the third sort of clump or question I wanted to talk about is something we were chatting about a little bit before the talk began, which is what I think of as the big bureaucracy problem, right? That a large state, especially in wartime, is going to look into everything under the sun, right? They're pressing for any advantage they can. And so, in a way, it would be shocking if they didn't attempt to reach out to Sino-Muslims, and if they didn't see them as, a potential bridge to, let's say, Afghanistan, which gets a lot of play in the book, though not so much in the talk today, or to the Middle East. And so I was wondering how much we know about the extent to which people beyond those explicitly charged with policy towards Muslims are thinking about this stuff, right? Yeah. So is, for instance, the initiative to sell tea are there people in the Ministry of Finance who are all excited about this? Are there, people in government-sponsored trade associations who are all excited about this? I'd just sort of like to get a little bit more of a sense of how much uptake there is throughout the Japanese imperial apparatus.
Mm-hmm.
And then I guess the last two things I want to mention are less about sort of what do the Japanese want, and they might more fit under the rubric of where does this story begin and end?
Mm-hmm.
And I guess in many ways, particularly where it begins. So, you make a really interesting case about how the Japanese are thinking about new export markets and trading partners, and they're thinking beyond the places we normally think of as part of the co-prosperity sphere. And that's one of the reasons they're interested in Muslims. Statistically, Japan's trade had been moving towards an Asian focus for a long time,
Mm-hmm.
right? Back in the late 1880s, the rest of Asia bought 23% of Japanese exports and provided only 9% of Japanese imports. By the late 30s, that's 57% of Japanese exports and 37% of Japanese imports. So there's a big trend that's going on, which is, has been unfolding over half a century, and I think is usually thought of as, motored primarily by things like, private sector strategizing
Mm-hmm.
rather than imperial grand strategy. And so I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about and at the flip side of that, of course, is that as those numbers are rising, the share of Japan's trade that goes to the North Atlantic world, to the US and Europe, is falling. And so I was wondering how that context, that sort of long run trend, influences or maybe doesn't influence the story you're telling about a sort of planned state organized initiative, and sort of how do we relate the geopolitical, civilizational, and economic motives here? I mean, there just seem like a lot of gears.
I know.
They're all kind of running in the same direction, which for a historian is a nuisance because it makes it really hard to figure out which ones are important. So, and then I guess the last sort of area I wanted to talk about is the last part of the book. I think is really fascinating in the way it talks about your story as it relates to post-1945 Pan-Asianism, Pan-Islamism, et cetera, and especially the kind of fascinating and frankly sort of icky ways in which holdovers from fascist programs figure into post-war movements that would have, at least officially, disclaimed any debt whatsoever to the Axis powers.
Right.
Right. And that's a really interesting story. But it's also a story that goes back before the Axis, right? I mean, colonialism, one of the reasons these trends, these ideas still have legs after 45 is that colonialism is still a big problem after 45, and that the Soviet Union is still there after 45 as well, right? And so an anti-Soviet, anti-colonial sort of set of interests is in some ways, it's natural to the Axis powers, and it's also natural to the post-war non-aligned movement and to the CCP, insofar as it's not simply towing a Soviet line, but trying to be an independent communist force. And I'd be interested to hear more about this. There are obviously reasons not to acknowledge the wartime influences, but are there signs that people are borrowing consciously from Axis rhetoric, et cetera, even if they won't say publicly. And then also, again, thinking about where does this story begin? The Axis, of course, doesn't invent this stuff out of thin air either, right? There were both national and transnational movements before they got involved and that they're trying to exploit, whether these are explicitly transnational things like 1920s and 30s Pan-Africanism, or whether they're anti-colonial figures whom we think of as nationalist, but who are, after all, looking for coalition partners and leverage. I mean, I think of someone like Vinayak Savarkar in India, who's about as fanatical a nationalist as you can find, but who, over the course of his career, reaches out to everybody from Chiang Kai-shek to Mussolini to the Irish Republican Army, right? Because anybody who he thinks might be anti-British is okay with him. So I guess I'd like to hear you talk a little bit about to what extent you see Japan and the Axis generally as truly creative contributors to this line of thought, as opposed to being just kind of the 1937 to 1945 pass-through for a set of anti-colonial and anti-Soviet ideas that begin well before them and carry on well after them. And I think with that, I have probably talked more than enough. So I look forward to hearing from you and from the audience.
Go ahead.
Thank you for all of those very thoughtful comments and questions. And I'll see if I can sort of unpack them kind of quickly, but sort of one at a time. And yeah, you are right to sort of acknowledge that these Sino-Muslims do not, they're sort of different because they really live in all urban spaces across China. They don't really have their own territory. But that the Japanese were, I think they were mostly interested in them because they saw them as like middlemen. And that's kind of a place that they had occupied for a long time. If we look at what they were doing in what the Hui were doing in Xinjiang in the late 19th century, they were really sort of intermediaries between different groups of people. And so I think within the context of what they were trying to achieve on the Chinese mainland, I don't know if they ever saw the Sino-Muslims as, perhaps people who could govern China for them. But I do think that they saw them as people who had traditionally been intermediaries for the state and could continue to do that in the capacity for them. There were efforts out in Xinjiang to create an independent Muslim nation state that were sponsored by the Japanese that never really came about. But one of the things I kind of like to remind people that, like, in 1936 or 1937, if you're a disenfranchised elite Sino-Muslim and the Chinese nationalists are offering you a program, essentially sort of like assimilative program of ethnopolitics, and the Chinese communists aren't really there for you, and the other options are the Soviets, I think for some people, the Japanese might have seemed like a good benefactor who could allow them to perhaps get into place certain reform agendas that they'd been thinking about for a while before that. So I think that that's kind of important to acknowledge. Okay. This idea of them being exceptional, I do think that there was, much like the Italians were doing, presenting themselves as sort of like Mussolini sort of presenting himself as a benefactor of Islam in North Africa, even though we know that the occupation of Libya was a complete fiasco, and all of these terrible things. And David Modedel has written extensively on Nazi Germany's connections with the Muslim world. I do think for the Axis, the three Axis powers really saw what the sort of quote unquote Muslim world as a space to help them undermine the flows of capital emanating from the North Atlantic. And I don't know, I've never really found documents that sort of connected these policies, but I do know that they were watching each other and they understood the value of Muslims in the spaces that they occupied as a potential leverage against the North Atlantic. I also think that the Japanese were very well aware that a lot of these places where they could no longer sell their products, like very high quality green tea, well, they were looking for other places to sell that. And so it's more of a reorientation of markets that they'd lost than a sort of, you know, thinking about how to realign their own export market, especially with goods from their colonies like Taiwan and Manchukuo, how they could continue to make those places profitable and make money off of them when they were losing the places in the north of, you know, the American markets and the British markets. So that I kind of found that really fascinating, that, you know, there was a lot of talk about creation of Muslim consumers, and if we make these goods, then Muslim, and we, you know, help these people come out of colonialism, then we'll be able to, you know, sell them all our stuff and sell them all of the water bottles that we make out of polyurethanes and things like that. So it was, I thought it was, I don't know. And so this brings me to your next question about big bureaucracy. I do think that some of these ideas sort of floated around in a small group of people who worked, you know, in a certain segment of the imperial bureaucracy. On saying that, though, I do know that when, for instance, when the Japanese invaded and occupied the Dutch East Indies, they sent a large contingent of scholars who worked on Islamic studies. They were some of the first people to arrive there, well aware that they, you know, they were going to be facing some of the similar issues with Muslim populations that they had in North China. And so I think that there was, at the grand strategy, higher bureaucratic level, an awareness of the sort of geostrategic value of Muslims. But I don't know if this, I've never really found any sort of high up policy stuff. And I think that in some ways, Ken, that just has to do with the kind of things I was looking at when I was doing my research. That stuff might be there. I just have never really come across it. And what I found was a sort of small niche group of intellectuals who were sort of co-opted by the Japanese imperial bureaucracy, who went out and worked in the field and wrote these field reports and circulated a lot of this knowledge amongst themselves. Where does this story begin and where does it end? Yeah, I think so. I think I might have sort of addressed some of that when I was talking about the displacing of markets that were lost. But I think that the end, this other question, this end part that you talk about, is actually something I'm working on right now, because there obviously is sort of holdover or continuity in the anti-Soviet and anti-imperial rhetoric that's coming from the CCP, but I'm trying to figure out if this is done consciously or not. And I haven't actually spent enough time digging into it to sort of figure that out. I need to do a lot more research on that. There are definitely Muslims, Sino-Muslims, who collaborated with the Japanese, who were then very quickly pardoned by the CCP because they realized, again, their geostrategic value. So in some ways, these elite Sino-Muslim men sort of always have had a sort of disproportionate role in geopolitics because of their connections to the world beyond East Asia. And, you know, that doesn't go unnoticed by either the Japanese Empire, the CCP, or the KMT in the 1950s and 1960s. So I think, just to sort of finish up, I think one of the things that I've found interesting in these conversations about, you know, anti-imperial and anti-Soviet rhetoric is really, and you asked if there's something particular about the Japanese formation of this. And I think one of the things that is particular is the post-war imagination of like what East and Southeast Asia are.
Mm.
And we bring that through the formation of this space. We sort of bring that with us into the post-war era. And that comes out of some of these, anti-colonial movements in that era. So I don't know if I've answered all of your questions, but I wrote all of them down, and I think there are things I'm going to need to continue to think about possibly for the next couple of years. I appreciate it.
I just wanted to add one footnote for this crowd, which is when you mentioned the continuing role of Sino-Muslims in sort of PRC foreign policy. We actually had quite a good undergraduate BA thesis this past year by a student who looked at the role that these Sino-Muslims played in early PRC ties to the PLO.
Oh, cool.
When they were sort of trying to wean the PLO away from a strictly Soviet patronage, and they wanted to get in the game too. And who did they use? They used Sino-Muslims.
Yeah, I would love to read that. It sounds great.
Okay, thank you. Thanks to you both. Let's go into the Q&A. The questions are rolling in. The first one, I think, is more a comment than a question about how Imperial Japan treated Muslim people better than the Chinese communists do nowadays. I don't know if you want to engage with that.
I would just say that I do not disagree with that at all.
The first real question then is Linda Eastwood, who asks, how much bearing does this history have on the present situations of Muslim Uyghurs? Does the history of Muslim anti-communism drive some of the oppression?
Okay, that's a good question, and it's one that I've had a few people ask me. I do not intend in any particular way to draw any parallels between Japanese imperialism on the mainland and what is happening currently in the PRC. But I do think that there is value in thinking about the ways that the Japanese imperial project perhaps formed and formulated some of the ethno-nationalist policy that was then later adopted by the Chinese communists, because we still operate in this model that it's the sort of Stalinist model that's been imposed on these people, these minority people. And I think what my work and other people's work is showing is that not only were the Chinese nationalists, but the Chinese communists were sort of looking at what the Japanese were doing in ways that had tangible outcomes on their minority policies in the 1950s and 1960s. And so I think as people start to sort of look for more, there's other people that are doing work on Inner Mongolia and other places. As some of that work starts to be published, we might begin to sort of acknowledge more evenly the ways that the Japanese imperial project had an impact on the formation of ethnic minority identities in the current People's Republic of China.
Okay, next question along similar lines is by Robert Bornholz. Insofar as the East Asia co-prosperity sphere presented itself as an opponent of Western individualist capitalist imperialism, were there features of Islamic thought that were congruent with this critique of the West? For example, Al-Ghazali and Ibn Taymiyyah's critique of philosophy.
Well, I'm not familiar with either of those scholars or philosophers, but I do know that there were very strong efforts by Japanese Pan-Asianists to sort of write about Pan-Islam, its connections to Pan-Islamism. And they did see that there, even very prominent Japanese Pan-Asianists like Ikeda Iki wrote extensively about the commonalities between Pan-Asianism and Pan-Islamism and the links and overlaps between those. So most of my exposure has come with from the ways that, that Japanese imperialism orientalists and Japanese Pan-Asianists thought about the relationship that it would have to other Pan-Asian or Pan-Islamist network or Pan-Islamism. I don't know if that specifically answers your question, but I think that there was an acknowledgement, and it was amongst Pan-Asianist thinkers, that Pan-Islamism was something that was valuable to thinking about how to construct the greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere.
Okay, just in general, if you ask questions and you would like a follow-up, I think we still have time. We have time until 6:15 with the possibility of going a little bit over time. And I have 4 more questions here in the pipeline. So if you want to follow up, I think we still have time for that. The next question is an anonymous one. My question is, many Sino-Muslims went to Japan for school or diplomatic purposes before and during World War II. How do you see their role on Japan's policies on Muslims?
Well, I think a lot of them, the Sino-Muslims who went to school in Japan in the early 20th century and early, the teens, and many of them went there because they were looking to get, good modernist educations, and they were not one of the first Chinese Muslim journals was actually published by the Muslim students who were studying in Tokyo. I think that many of them probably went back, but by the time I'm talking about, the majority of the people that are going to study in Tokyo are going there being sponsored by the Japanese. So it's a kind of a different situation. The students who are going to study in the 1930s and 1940s are there because of Japan's imperial policies. So they're not really, they have a different reason, I think, for being there. And so I'm not sure if that really answers the question, but I'm not sure if I'm deciphering it or understanding it properly.
Okay, thank you. Next question is by Jackie.
Oh, hi, Jackie.
Armiro. I was also intrigued by all the reports on potential trading benefits with Muslim countries. Who was the audience for these reports? And was there an effort to get the Japanese general public on board with these efforts to connect with the Muslim world? And if yes, had there been any public criticism of these government policies in the early period?
Yeah, that's a great question. Thank you, Jackie. I'm happy to see that you're here. Yeah, in 1938 and 1939, there was a large public exhibition about the Muslim world that circulated Japan, and the Japanese Islamic Association estimated that 100,000 people went to go see it. So there were definitely efforts to sort of explain the value of these spaces to Japanese subjects and people living in the Japanese home islands at the time. And I think that part of that was, to sort of understand that their trading networks and the people that they were trading with were going to be different. And part of this, Jackie, you raised an important question, because one of the things that was different and difficult about, Muslims as opposed to Buddhists or other, religious groups that might have been, or Christians who were well known in Japan at the time, was that there really were not very many Japanese Muslims, and the Japanese Muslim Association sort of needed to run these campaigns to sort of explain who Muslims were. So if we look at a lot of publications that are circulated in Japan in the 1930s, there's lots of articles that are meant for sort of general consumption and for the general population to read about, Muslims in the occupied Dutch East Indies and Muslims in different parts of the empire. So I do think that there was a concerted effort by a certain segment of the Japanese bureaucracy to educate Japanese people on the home island about Muslims, and especially use them extensively in propaganda to sort of undermine the Soviets and undermine imperial powers that were operating in East Asia.
Okay, thank you. I'll come to the last question on the list. So if anybody in the audience would like to add a question, please do. I will have one more at the end, but
Okay.
the question here is a personal one. How many languages did you have to master to carry out such a wide-ranging project? I can only say I know it was a lot.
I don't know if master is quite the right word, but I read French. I grew up in Canada, so I speak French fluently, and I also took Italian in high school, so I read Italian, although I don't speak it at all. So I was able to read a number of documents in Italian with some help. And then Chinese is my primary research language, and Japanese is my secondary research language, which is something I continue to work on. I take Japanese lessons every week because it is so hard, and I don't think I will ever master Japanese, but you know, we all have goals in our life, and I just keep plugging away at it. So.
Okay, good. Then let me add a question, or perhaps even two questions. So one question I have is about the term that is the term used for Sino-Muslims in Japanese, which is apparently the same as in Chinese, Huijiaotu. And what is the connotation of that? So one thing it signals is that there is relatively little prior exposure in Japan to Islam and Islamic populations in Asia, since Japanese, when they talk about this, they use a very specifically Chinese term.
Yeah.
And maybe you could tell us a little bit more about what prior encounters with Muslim populations, say from the Meiji period on, let's not go into prehistory, but what prior encounters took place, and is there anything else? Are there any other currents that shape that engagement, or were Sino-Muslims the obvious and only go-to population for Japanese who wanted to engage with Muslims? And then connected to that is the question: how would Muslim populations elsewhere respond to that term as a generic term for Muslims? Because if they would understand it at all, they would certainly say, this is not us, this is the Chinese Muslims, who for the most part are not very good Muslims.
Right. Okay, so yeah, and it's even pronounced similarly in Japanese. It's kaikyoto. So they're really one of the things that I used some other people's work to sort of flesh some of this out, was that when Japanese scholars of Islam started getting interested in Islam, and really it was the late 19th century as they begin to sort of make their way into after the first Russo-Japanese, after the Sino-Japanese War, and then after the Russo-Japanese War. But before that, there had really, in the Meiji period, there had been 2 diplomatic missions, one to the Qajar court in Iran, which became Iran, and another to Istanbul. And that was really the beginning of Japan's relationship with any Muslims. Before that, they're not really mentioned at all in a lot. You know, there's lore that all of these Han Kitab books from the Chinese circuit circulated in Japan. They might have had a couple copies in someone's library, but I don't think that would have been very, very, very specialized knowledge. So it's really not until the late 19th century. And one of the things that happens when Japanese scholars of Islam try to start translating the Quran into Japanese, they have to draw on Buddhist terminology, because they don't really have words that they know, don't really know how to make these things understandable in a context where people don't know what Islam is. So there are definitely problems trying to make this legible and understandable to people who would have no context of it whatsoever. And then with regards to Muslim, I guess, I don't know if this would have been a problem, because I don't, you know, people outside of the East Asian context wouldn't have read this, so they wouldn't have known. But there were definitely problems, you know, when a lot of these Sino-Muslims went to places they experienced for the first time. You know, many of them were you know, the religiosity of as Muslims was questioned, and you know, there's this sort of Arab-centric you know, sphere, and a lot of them sort of try to overcome that by go study at Al-Azhar in Egypt, and sort of become fluent and prominent scholars working in Arabic. But whether or not, you know, Muslims in, you know, North Africa or the Middle East would have even known what these terms were is something I just don't think that would have been probably part of, you know, what they would have just been Chinese.
Right.
Chinese
thank you. I think we have time for one last question by Saul Thomas. Hello, Saul. So the question is, I'm curious about the resistance to Japanese colonialism in the Dutch East Indies and the role of Islam in it, and whether there was any discussion among Muslims elsewhere about Japanese rule over Indonesian Muslims there. My curiosity comes from the fact that Indonesia is now considered to be one of the largest Muslim countries, and I understand that there were many instances of brutality towards the native population there by the Japanese army.
Yeah, so the Japanese did privilege Islam in a way that the Dutch did not. And they sort of brought back a number of exiled figures like Hatta and Sukarno, who were sort of both of them were skeptical of the Japanese, but worked with them to achieve their anti-colonial goals of sort of getting rid of the Dutch. So some people sort of frame the Japanese occupation of Indonesia as this sort of like weird anti-colonial interregnum. But the Japanese did institute a number of policies. Yes, their rule was brutal. They did not have enough military on the ground to rule very well, and a lot of places outside of sort of large urban centers were that there was a lot of resistance to the Japanese rule. But they did institute a number of policies that had started in North China that were in direct opposition to things that the Dutch were doing, such as teaching Indonesian and Javanese in school. And that sort of gave people a way to, what am I trying to say? It presented an opportunity for people that were privy to some of these spaces to, you know, foment more anti-colonialism after the war was over. So, yeah, the specific case of Indonesia is really complicated, and I'm still trying to say, the specific case in Indonesia is particularly complicated, and there's a lot of people that work specifically on that. So I would direct you to the work of Ethan Mark, who is much more of an expert on Indonesia than I am in this specific period. But I appreciate the question. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Thanks, Kelly. Thanks, Ken. Thanks to everybody who asked questions, and thanks to everybody in the audience. Thanks for joining us. I hope you enjoyed this. Please join the Center for East Asian Studies again for the next installment of the East Asia by the Book author talks round. That's next Thursday, April 22nd, and it will feature Peggy Wong at Bowdoin College, who is Associate Professor of Art History and Asian Studies, and will talk about her recent book, The Future History of Contemporary Chinese Art. For information about this event and also other upcoming book talks, please visit the the website of the Center for East Asian Studies. There's a link, I believe, in the chat box. So for this talk and also other talks in the spring quarter. So thanks once again. Thanks to
Thank you.
Kelly, and have a good evening, everybody.
Thank you.